Hello everyone, welcome to the Eternal Patch Breakdown. My name is Pojo, and today we are going to be talking about the balance changes that just went live today. So there's a bunch of interesting stuff that has happened. We have some new balance changes to Expedition and to Throne. Both are obviously affected since the cards are shared between the two formats, and several of the Throne nerfs actually do affect Expedition. Well, all of the Expedition nerfs, of course, do affect Throne. But yeah, there's a couple of interesting things that have happened, and in addition, there's some cool stuff going on for Turkey Day. So if you are so inclined, you can certainly get the Smuggler bundle. It's a decently good deal. It gets you an alt art Red Canyon Smuggler and a bunch of other things. A lot of packs and gems and stuff for about $30. So that's available in the Eternal Store. Take a look if you want to. If you buy it from the Eternal Store, you get an extra draft ticket and an extra 500 gems. So worth noting, the card is pretty cool, and I would say that definitely take a look at that if you are so inclined. But that is not what we are primarily here today to discuss. So let me see if we can hide that. Okay, cool. All right, and yeah, we're going to be talking about the balance changes. So, obviously, Cultists was a pretty consistent and powerful deck in Expeditions, and in Throne, the meta was starting to thrive on Praxis, with specifically Zoltar Kenan decks and a decent amount of just big Kairos decks being like major mid-range threats that were dominating a pretty significant percentage of the meta. That was sort of the position before the patch nerfs. That was where we were. And now let's talk a little bit about where we are. So first things first, on the list of nerfs, Karnas Waystone Harvester, listed as a Throne nerf, has gone from a 3/4 to a 2/4. So this card is generally pretty powerful, and like the overall stat line of it was always very, very strong. It was a good 3-drop with efficient stats that also gave you maximum power and also had a twist ability that made the card a lot more vulnerable, but also allowed you to get to some pretty significant heights with power if you were so inclined and you felt safe in doing so. That's a lot of different things that were generally pretty good about it. The risk of it was in twisting it when you shouldn't have. The rewards of it were always there, so now the card has a little bit more risk in that it is not capable of sparring with a wide variety of the more aggressive units that opponents are sitting on. It is still a good stonewall, but it can't really trade with things like Teacher of Humility and other sorts of cards like that, so you can attack into it a lot more aggressively with a lot of the Stone Scar aggro. Anything with 3 health is just going to be a little bit better at sort of charging through it, and yeah, Big Praxis has suffered a little bit from the loss of Karnas Waystone Harvester. This was not a major card in any of my Praxis decks, and actually, like, I think of all the Praxis nerfs that came out, none of them were actually the cards that I use a lot of. I have taken Zoltar Kenan out of my everything but my market at this point, and that is also getting nerfed here. So yeah, it's an interesting choice for something to nerf on Praxis, and I think it's a pretty solid one, especially since this one sort of supports the Praxis plan of playing a bunch of good mid-range and then getting to the bigger stuff at the top. And that's something that like basically is not so amazing if you are playing good cards all the way up to the top and then playing Kairos at the top. It's a pretty consistent problem in Throne. I don't think that Karnas is necessarily going to be the final solve for this, because there's plenty of different ways to get to the Praxis top, but it does mean that you are playing a little bit more of a defensive game and a little bit less of like an aggressive one, and I think that's something that definitely does seem like a reasonable nerf to me, even if I shall sorely miss our 3/4 Karnas, which traded so well with many other things. I'm a big time fan, so it's always sad to see a time nerf, but yeah, I don't think it was unwarranted, and Praxis clearly did need something. Zoltar Kenan has gone from a 5 cost or a 5 durability to a 4 durability. So this card was a big culprit in many of the big decks. It was played with Shenra, Speaks, and Harsh Rule, and if you were playing both of those things, then it was very, very hard to kill under pretty much any circumstances. This makes Zoltar Kenan a lot more vulnerable to a wide variety of different tricks, a lot of spells that deal extra damage. You can now mortar this, you can now torch it with spell damage off of the common Skycrag lists. You can trade over it with Champion of Chaos and get much better results. Like, there's just a lot more ways to get actual damage onto Zoltar Kenan, despite the fact that it is very good at defending itself and has a significant amount of durability. I'm of the opinion that 5 durability sites are pretty unlikely to be a good idea in general. Bastion of the Dawn is the only one that seems like relatively underpowered, and in general, the higher that we've seen the durability on sites, the more frequently those cards have really dominated the meta. I'm fine with low durability on sites. I think that sites are generally cards that you want to see like a decent amount of like interesting interactions with, but you also don't want to stick around on board unless the opponent is doing something very, very right. And yeah, low durability on sites is just generally fine. Like, I think that there are very few sites that you want to just tank with, and Zoltar Kenan was one that was certainly doing a lot of that work. The loss of durability does not prohibit the strength of this card. This is still a great card to get a lot of power out of your deck, play good defensive units, get the Harmony of Flame effect, and generally like increase the late game potential of your deck by a pretty significant margin. It's a very strong card. It's still a very strong card. The nerf was entirely warranted, and yeah, overall, like, this seems like it's not going to affect its power level. I think it's still a pretty tier 1 card that just will have a little bit more interaction with it with a bunch of the other tier 1 decks. So Praxis should go down a few percentage points, but overall, I don't think it's going to be too heavily hurt by those 2 nerfs. The other nerf is also to an Expedition card, Edict of Shaka, a very common market option and occasionally a main board option due to its ability to basically turn off Champion of Cunning and Jotun Feastcaller. Yeah, like, this card was really, really strong, and certainly very, very strong in Expedition. I'm actually a little bit bothered by this nerf in terms of like reducing power points off of Fire and Expedition, because Fire's general position in Expedition has not been amazingly strong in most situations. Stonescar Dragons certainly have like a decent amount of power points, but it's hard to run a lot of the other interesting Fire formats. Like, you certainly can't do Skycrag right now, and Skycrag spell damage was, I think Edict of Shaka was one of the key cards in sort of that list. So this kind of has some ripple effects on the general like Skycrag list. I'd love to see some Skycrag buffs to go with it. Maybe like actually get some more spell damage or more health on some of the spell damage cards. It's an interesting strategy. I'd be curious to see a deck that actually like plays pretty well. But yeah, the Howling Peak deck exists, so it's not the end of the world that Edict of Shaka has been nerfed. This does not, of course, remove Edict of Shaka from the market or even from play. It just makes it so it's a little bit more awkward and difficult to play the card, and less likely to be good against the major tempo format cards that you might see. It's still a lovely card against Burst Warfern, a lovely card against Champion of Cunning, and a lovely card against Jotun Feastcaller. And overall, it's still a fine edict and a pretty strong option against a wide variety of sites and a wide variety of other options. It's just a little bit inefficient now if it is not dealing damage to green or blue effects. So it's going to be pretty strictly a market card from here on out, and also a market card that you have to play on something like 5 or the turn after you draw it from your merchant on 4. So a little bit slower to come out, a little bit less effective, but potentially still reasonable in some ways. Okay, next an Expedition nerf that actually affects Throne. Slumbering Stone has been changed from Entomb, create and play a 2/2 Gargoyle with Flying, to Entomb, create and draw a 2/2 Gargoyle with Flying. So the Gargoyle goes into your hand, and then you have to play it as a 2/2 so to get the flyer, which means that you are getting card advantage out of this card still, but you are not getting as much board advantage and as much abrupt board advantage as previously. A 1-cost 2/2 is a pretty good thing. A 1-cost 0/2 that turns into a 2/2 turns out to be a better thing pretty frequently. One of the things about Slumbering Stone is that it promotes a type of basically board stall. If you play this card on 1, people are not usually likely to attack into it, especially aggro decks, which feel pretty uncomfortable attacking into a card that is not only going to block the damage, but also create a new unit that is going to like get more value and also push over the top of you while potentially carrying things like Beastcaller's Amulet or Lethrai Felchen over your head. Felchen not so much, but I would say Beastcaller's Amulet has been like a pretty solid option on that front. Giving people evasive units is something that people tend to balk at, and I would say that a lot of aggressive decks have been kept in check by Slumbering Stone in the past, while yeah, it's been a really solid card in the Cultists list, because it creates that board stall where even like the 3/1 that has Overwhelm is not super comfy attacking into Slumbering Stone just because of the power it creates. Also, it's a good Devour target. You get to create some really interesting combat trick states. And finally, as you play Vara in the late game, the card triggers just a wide variety of different useful effects, and frequently triggers Vara off of Devour and other types of sort of generally scary effects. So there's a lot of things that can happen here that make Slumbering Stone like particularly rough in both the late game and the early game, and the way that it punishes people in the late game with Vara and in the early game with the sort of board stall state, neither of those are particularly fun effects. I'm pretty happy to see this change. It is definitely a big change, and one that really affects the play pattern of not only Throne decks but also Expedition decks. So a lot of Shadow players are not as excited about this one, but I would say that overall it seems relatively warranted. Slumbering Stone has always been a very powerful card when it comes to sacrifice effects. I don't think that the card is completely unplayable now, but I do think that it has a lot less board state, which, considering how much reward you get for devouring or eating the card in general, like, it is just a pretty strong option for a free card that you can frequently get back with Shadowlands Cultist and a wide variety of other like available options. I think this card probably deserves the nerf. Certainly Vara is more of a problem in general in the late game, but like, this is a good early game nerf to Cultists that I think really increases the ability to interact with that deck. The one notable thing about this is that it does make it a lot easier to run aggro decks, which is something we're going to be talking about as we look at some of the other cards that have gotten nerfed as well. So Worthy Cause in Expedition has gone from 1 to 2. Sacrifice a unit to silence an enemy unit, give it -1/-1, and of course Decimate for lifesteal. This was considered the best removal in the format by a decently large margin, because sacrificing a unit was mostly free due to the prevalence of good 1-drops that had really beneficial effects if they were sacrificed. Thank you for the sub, Risper Viper. Or Risper Visper. Cheers, cheers, cheers. But yeah, like, I would say that it is definitely a little bit weaker now because you don't have quite as many useful 1-drops to sacrifice. It's still really good for triggering exalted triggers like the exalted time decimate power, and of course any sort of 1-drops you want to sacrifice to Shadowlands Cultist. It's still pretty good with Slumbering Stone and a wide variety of other units, but people may not be playing Slumbering Stone in that format now that Worthy Cause has gone down to 2, which means that the Cultist deck is going to have a little bit less interaction in the early game, as well as a lot less lifesteal later on if they are not playing this card, which I imagine they still will. It's a pretty consistent removal card that also gets rid of very, very large threats and silences a lot of things that this deck would rather silence, as well as giving you lifesteal and other available options. Yeah, it's a pretty sincere nerf, and I think it's one of the more desired and more requested nerfs for the Cultist deck. It's definitely something that should have a serious impact on that deck's capacity to function, especially in the early game. Should open up some good interaction opportunities. However, it is a nerf to removal, which means that other aggro decks may be able to take up the cause against these types of decks. So, pun intended. All right, so finally in Karnas, Makar's Listener, we knew this one was coming. There were a lot of speculations on what it was going to be, but Karnas was widely considered to be the most powerful card in the format, and still is pretty dang good. 3/3 gone down to 3/2. So you can now char it. You can now hit it with Storm Spiral. You can now trade with it if you are attacking with smaller 2/2s, which are very frequent. There's a lot of 2/3s in the format, and Karnas, Makar's Listener was notable in that it was a 4-drop that could block those cards while also giving you a shadow card, while also giving you an unblockable way to win the game. Now it just does two things. It gives you a lot of card advantage, and it gives you an unblockable way to win the game if your opponent does not have the correct removal for it. But dies to double Vara's favor, dies to a bunch of killer effects, dies to a wide variety of other things, trades very poorly, doesn't really work very well on defense anymore. Karnas is still far and away the strongest listener of the 5. Unblockability is just a really, really big deal. That mastery is still very achievable, and despite the card's new vulnerability, the shadow pool of invoke options is still extremely strong. So I don't think this card is going away anytime soon, but I do think that this is a nerf that allows people to interact with it in a fairly fair manner and occasionally pick it up for free in some situations, which would be a wildly good thing considering the card gives your opponent a card for free. The listeners are all very powerful, and I think they generally should be. They're pretty well pushed engines that tend to guide certain decks down certain paths, and I would love to see some of the other listeners buffed in the meantime to see if they can actually get a little bit more strength in the process. Like Wodar is basically unplayable at the moment, as is Izuzi, so there's some other cards that I would have liked to see buffed in addition to these nerfs, but the primary focus on Cultists definitely makes sense considering it was the dominant deck in both the ECQ and afterwards. Like this deck has taken over the meta. So that is mostly it. There are three other buffs. We have a change to Verret, which I actually really do not like, but we'll talk about that a little bit. So the changes to Verret are the Verret transformations have all changed a little bit. Verret the Wise has gone down from a 4/4 to a 3/4, which is definitely a requested change from me. I think that Verret the Wise was always quite strong, and like being able to have Aegis and basically just get a much bigger unit from putting a large weapon on it tended to be very, very disgusting and create a lot of different issues. I kind of would have preferred this card to be like a 3/3, but I think that that's fine if you are trying to make the card just like a little bit more interesting and a little bit more interactable. I think that's a pretty solid change. Verret the Stealthy has gone from a 3/5 to a 4/5, which is a pretty good change as well. The lifesteal form was not really chosen because the lifesteal ability was not very useful. The card did not really stabilize you in most situations, and usually you just had no reason to pick lifesteal because the stats were so weak in comparison to Verret the Mighty, which was a much better blocker, and Verret the Wise, which was much better at preventing you from getting removed. I don't think Verret the Stealthy will be a particularly high pick even now, but it does mean that you have a much better chance of picking Verret the Stealthy over Verret the Wise, and I think that sort of making it so that those three are a little bit more on board with each other is definitely an interesting change up to Verret in general. My general problem is Verret's base, I think, is really, really strong, particularly with Jack's Knife and Kayla's Persuader. There are a lot of really good decks that can easily activate Verret very early, and then using Verret the Wise spiral the game out of control. And I'm not necessarily certain that taking a single power point off of Verret the Wise is enough to make that a different change. The fact that you're getting killed by 3 different versions of Verret is maybe still going to be pretty difficult to get around. Verret the Mighty has gone from a 6/6 to a 6/7, which means the card is now a 2-drop that turns into a 6/7 with fairly minimal investment, and then gets Mastery 12 +5/+5 and Exalted if you attack with it further. This card is kind of absurd for a 2-drop in colorless. I think that there is just way too many power points in the card in general, and I think it's definitely well picked up and well used, and overall I don't love its pattern very much. A lot of the removal in the game at the moment is pretty dedicated towards being color hate. Like you have a lot of edicts and other options that are specifically good at killing deck cards of one color. You have Cast into Shadow, which can only kill monocolored cards. You have cards that care about how many different colors you have. And thank you for the raid, Ilion. But yeah, like we're just like, overall, this is going to be like a pretty wild thing in terms of the extra strength of the card. I'm not happy with this change. I think that like Verret the Mighty was a perfectly reasonable form previously, and also I would have liked to have seen Verret's like base form see a little bit less play. But yeah, the card exists and it's out there, and there's a wide variety of mastery decks that can exist with it. It can certainly steamroll, and there's a lot of different options to steamroll with now that you now have a stealthy and a mighty form that are both very powerful, as well as a wise form that is still very good if you are playing weapons on the card, which is still one of the most frequent things that you're doing with Verret. So yeah, I'm not a fan of that change, but I think that overall I don't mind Verret's lifesteal form going up, and I don't mind Verret's wise form going down. It's just extra buffs to the card definitely seem to be a thing that maybe it doesn't need. Okay, so Inspired Prank has gone from 4 to 3. That makes a lot of sense. This card was not very good. I'm still not very fond of the design of Inspired Prank. This is a card that rewards you for being in Yetis and spells. And overall, like, as a bargain, it's always been pretty underwhelming. I think that getting a large snowman off of Yeti is not the most interesting or tricksy thing that you can do with Yeti, and Yeti are typically, if not tricksy, at least a little kooky in how they behave in aggro. There's a lot of like weird stuff that they get to do relating to stuns and snowballs and other sort of like unusual things that they can play around with. You have cards like Yeti Pult, you have like Griffin Riders with Berserk and Flying. All of the cards in Yetis are always just like a little bit weird. This card is a little bit standard. It feels like something you might see out of like a Time or a Justice spell, and basically it just makes a vanilla unit. I think the unit is pretty underwhelming, and the fact that it's free in Yeti is still okay, but I've never been particularly inspired by Inspired Prank, and I think reducing it in cost is not really the thing that fixes the problems with Inspired Prank in terms of what it does. It still really cares about you having not only a large amount of Yeti, but a large amount of spells in your Void, and by the time that you have both of those, you've probably killed your opponent with Yeti, both in Expedition and in Ranked. So I'm uncertain if this is a particularly good change, but like, hey, it's a buff to a card that was terrible, so there's nothing particularly wrong with that. Elvish Swindler. 3/4, so it was a 2/3. This is a really cool change. Not only does it enable you to do some really cool things with Relics and Throne, it also makes it a much better draft card, and also makes it really interesting in Expeditions for transformation decks. So if you're playing Mass Polymorph and Vargo's Pelt, Elvish Swindler is a great way to fetch Vargo's Pelt now that it is a viable unit with a viable stat line. A 5-cost 2/3 was always too much risk for too little reward. Like, you just couldn't get the rate out of this card. It would never trade with anything, and like, this is a card that as a 3/4 at least stops all the 2/3s and 3/3s that are attacking you and giving you some semblance of like a hard time. So even though it's not going to be particularly efficient, it at least stops the aggro and gets you some potentially good trades, or potentially stonewalls your opponent out of very easy aggro while you are looking for your relics and creating some interesting options. So yeah, it's a solid card. I really am appreciative of this buff, and I think that's a pretty good change up for the card in general. So that's where we stand with the new buffs, nerfs, and general balance changes. Obviously, a lot of attention was paid to two very dominant decks that were very dominant in both the Throne and Expedition meta. The thing that worries me about these balance changes is that they definitely respect the takeover of Cultists as the predominant deck in the format, but maybe don't respect some of the different shifts that we saw in the meta before Cultists took over. Like, before Cultists took over, we definitely saw an Elysian deck that was extremely powerful, using Sodi Spellshaper, Borderland Scout, and a wide variety of other units, and the only bad matchup that that deck seemed to have was Cultists, which then sort of took over the entire game in a very short period of time. Now that Cultists are getting nerfed, I'm really curious to see if that Elysian deck is going to come back, or if any other variety of mastery role decks, Huru, Combre, or otherwise, are going to sort of take over the meta. I'm not sure that this balance change basically does enough to make the meta more interesting. Typically around this time, in like the middle of the second month or close to the third one, we might be seeing a rotation of the draft packs. We might be seeing like some serious change-ups, and thus far all we've gotten is sort of nerfs to existing decks that were definitely very, very toxic. So I'm more interested in seeing like a wider variety of nerfs from the Eternal at the moment. Like, we had a lot of different things happening, and I think that like maybe only a few of the problems have been addressed, but like, as far as things go, like, I am pretty excited about Cultists going away for a bit and Praxis stuff going away for a bit. I just sort of wish that these particular balance changes read a little bit more like an attempt to push more interesting strategies, and a little bit less like an attempt to solve just serious problems in the meta. Like basically, like we want those problems solved, but we also want them solved from. I would also like to see like other angles and other avenues open up. And I don't know that necessarily the opportunity for those new decks has been created, or the opportunity for new cards to be played has been created. So we'll see. Hopefully the Expedition meta thrives and the Throne meta thrives. Only time will tell on that one, but we're going to take a look and find out in the very near future. The new season starts next month, and I'm sure everyone's excited to get going. We've already got our triple master, and we are ranked, we are sealed rank 5, I think, right now. So pretty excited to flip over to the next season, open up a bunch of new packs, and try out some brand new decks in a very interesting new meta. That's gonna be pretty exciting. I'm very, very pleased with where Eternal's going, and looking pretty excited for what's happening in the future. So hopefully we see some more cool buffs and nerfs in the future, but like, yeah, the current balance changes are at least enough. So we'll see what ends up happening there. Thank you all so much for watching. That is it for tonight. So we are going to be logging off. And yeah, thanks to the YouTube folks. Feel free to like or subscribe. And to the Twitch folks, we are wrapping it up as well. But let's say our goodbyes first. So see you guys next time.